Good morning, everybody. Don't know if you are continuing your presence with us from the first session, but we are starting session 2 of 4 today for your making sure you don't get your tinsel in a tangle, and for those that are needing some end of the year HSW credits. We are happy to have this morning Justice Jones on a topic: building resilience at the Wildland-Urban Interface. My name is Stacy Sire, and I'm the current president of CSINext. So I just want to say thank you for joining us. And I'm going to give an introduction to our speaker. By the way, we will have chat open, and so please pop in and say who you are and where you're from. That's really fun for our online chapter because we don't get a chance to really interact like other groups do. So please let us know where you're joining us from today. We would love to see that. And also, I'm going to, we'll have the questions open, so you can also ask questions along the way. So good morning or afternoon, everybody, wherever you're joining us from. Somebody was from Nova Scotia last session. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Justice Jones. He is one of the nation's leading voices in wildfire mitigation and wildland-urban interface risk reduction. Justice brings more than 20 years of hands-on experience developing strategic wildfire programs and shaping policy at every level of the government. Before joining ICC, he led Austin Fire Department's Wildfire Mitigation Division, where he helped pioneer community-focused approaches to reducing wildfire risk. He's also previously served as the Wildland-Urban Interface Program Coordinator for Texas A&M Forest Service. He is widely recognized for his expertise in hazard mitigation and for guiding the development of community wildfire protection plans across the country. His work has helped communities build resilience, which they need, and we all need more and more each year as it seems. He helps to strengthen preparedness, which is probably the basis of everything going forward, and navigate the complex challenges of living in fire-prone landscapes. I'm very interested to hear. I know we don't have enough time to hear everything that you have to say, Justice, but very interested and so happy you're willing to join us today to share something that I'm very unfamiliar with. So with that, Justice, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stacy, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today. Thank you for sharing some of your time with me. And my hope is this is information that you can take back to your local area or jurisdiction and put to good use to enhance our nation's public safety in the face of wildfire, especially. So really excited to be here and looking forward to just spending this time with you talking about something I'm very passionate about, which is wildfire resilience, because I believe that we do have the tools and resources to navigate this crisis, but it will take all of us. So thank you for I won't go into the bio any further. Just know that I'm excited to be here with you today. And as Stacy mentioned, we're going to talk about some of the national wildfire trends and the implications for our built environment. We'll look at some major case studies where we've had recent wildfire losses and identify some of the common denominators of those losses. We're going to summarize some of the nation's wildfire history and its current risk profile, including contributing factors in some of the more vulnerable regions. So New Jersey popped in there, but we'll be talking more broadly than that. And we're going to explain the purpose and the scope of the ICC Wildland-Urban Interface Code and its role in enhancing community resiliency. So let's dive right in. The role of the International Code Council, if you weren't aware, and most of you probably are, we're a nonprofit corporation dedicated to building safety and public protection. We are mission-driven, building safer to protect lives and preserve property. And we know now more than ever with wildfires, the safer the building, the safer the occupants. Code development leaders and develop and maintain widely adopted safety codes and standards for residential and commercial buildings. And we're also a national presence and a global impact. ICC is working diligently to expand building safety to other parts of the globe. We're headquarters out of Washington, D.C., and as I mentioned, we're working to have influence beyond the U.S. borders. We've got an extensive network of 61,000 members, and I hope many of you are members. If you're not, I encourage you to consider joining and signing up. And we have 412 active ICC chapters. And those members and chapters are supported by over 700 highly qualified professional staff. So ICC is really a service-based organization, and we're here to support you in your efforts. The code development process, you're probably familiar with this, but I'll just give a kind of high-level overview. It's a democratic approach to developing and publishing the codes. It seeks input from professionals from across disciplines to make sure the codes are well-rounded and represent community values. The code development committees are users, builders, owners, designers, insurance companies, private inspecting agencies, and academic organizations. And some of the producers of the outcomes of the code are builders, contractors, manufacturers, and distributors. There's a genuine lack of wildfire and risk resiliency in general to natural disasters. Although organizations like ICC and others have worked really hard to institute building codes in the most at-risk areas, only 21% of natural hazard-prone jurisdictions have adopted hazard-resistant building codes. We've got a lot of work to do, a long way to go. And we're looking at the adoption status by percentage of population in natural hazard-resistant jurisdictions. Only 38% of our population is covered. And so we have a lot of vulnerable populations out there. And especially when it comes to wildfire, it may not be evident to everyone that they're at risk. And we'll talk about some of the tools for bringing awareness. And I just wanted to mention that the family of codes works together to support building safety. And so they're interconnected and interrelated. The I-codes and natural hazard mitigation, they work to mitigate structure, fire, wildfire, including urban conflagrations, which is the most current threat to our built environment from wildfires, earthquakes, other seismic events, tsunamis, floods, wind, rain, snow, and ice. So it's not the world of rainbows and butterflies, but it's the world of keeping people safe so they can enjoy those things. It truly is a national wildfire crisis that we're experiencing. Just in 2024 alone, we experienced 64,000 wildfire incidents. This year in 2025, we're up to 62,000 wildfires, but not all wildfires are equal, and we'll talk about that a little bit further in the presentation. 8.9 million acres have burned this year. That's 6.2 million over the previous year. And in 2024, we experienced 4,552 structures destroyed. The majority of those are residential single-family structures, but we are seeing an increase in commercial and mixed residential losses. And we've seen that more and more broadly as these fires move into urban areas. Think the LA fire, the Fort McMurray fire in Canada burned a lot of commercial and non-residential buildings. So this isn't just a residential issue, this is a built environment issue. So before we move too deeply in talking about terms and using acronyms, which I tend to be prone to, I wanted to define the Wildland-Urban Interface, or the WUI. It might sound fun, it's not. It's the zone of transition between unoccupied land and human development, or the line or area or zone where structures and other human development meet or intermingle with undeveloped wildland vegetative fuels. What's important about that is the extent. More than 44 million residents and 60,000 communities in the U.S. are at risk from wildfire. Majority of those folks are unaware of that wildfire risk. And the WUI continues to grow by approximately 2 million acres per year. The majority of development happening in the U.S. right now, 72% is happening in the wildland-urban interface. So we have a chance to either let this problem expand or get ahead of it and start developing communities that were designed not to burn. And we're seeing major insured losses from wildfires. Just a couple of highlights. The Camp Fire in Paradise, California was $12 billion. And that's a relatively small community. The Tubbs Fire in 2017 was 11 billion. The Woolsey Fire in California was 5.3 billion. The Maui Fire in Hawaii was 4.4 billion, and that list continues to grow. One that's interesting outside of California is the Marshall Fire, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on in one of our case studies, because the Marshall Fire would have been in an area that traditionally would have been considered low to moderate risk. And so the perception around risk is really challenging because people interpret risk maps and things like low to mean no. And we know that that's not true for sure. And our biggest loss by far in national history is the LA fires that happened in 2025 in January, over $250 billion in losses. And that's just to date. That's not secondary impacts. And we'll talk about some of those secondary impacts. So we're seeing this is just as much a life safety issue as it is a building safety issue. We're seeing a major increase in the number of wildland related fatalities, both to the public and to firefighters. The public health impacts are astronomical. It's one thing to breathe smoke from a forest fire, which is thousands of plants burning all at once. And we know through research on tobacco that even one plant can be hazardous to our health. When you mix in buildings, all kinds of construction type materials, cars, you're really talking about toxic smoke plumes. And California did some research recently over the last about 8 years of wildfires. And what they found out is people are dying from wildfires, not just directly, but indirectly. And we see about a 72% increase in EMS calls when these wildfires occur. And one of the reports that I'll reference later on quantified the number of indirect losses, meaning people who were transported to the ER for respiratory distress or cardiac issues. They weren't being documented as wildfire related when in reality, they look back at the time frames and those people were being impacted by wildfire. And so we've seen over 100,000 fatalities just related to wildfire and smoke. So it's a really major issue for public health. We're losing tax base in some communities, and they're smaller communities are having a difficult time even recovering. I mentioned on the Marshall Fire, they had to pass bonds to keep wheels on the fire trucks and gas in the engines because they lost so much of their tax base in one fire. The astronomical cost of infrastructure repair and replacement, soil destabilization, which can lead to cascading effects, the floods we were seeing in California and New Mexico. Gentrification, very often people are underinsured in these areas. They may have generational homes, and those homes get lost in one fire, and the family's dislocated because the cost of building is more than they're insured for. We can't underestimate the tourism and economic impacts of shutting down thoroughfares, events, things along those lines. And then watershed damage, that's becoming an increased issue across the nation. We're already seeing shortages in water supply. What happens when we contaminate that precious water with the debris of thousands of homes burning? So wildfire frequency, cause, and economic impact. We've seen a 57% increase above the 10-year average in 2025. Majority of fires are caused by humans, about 85%. Some of those are infrastructure fires, railroads, utilities, but by and large, about 70% of fires are caused by individual activities. So we can make a difference through education on fire prevention, but it won't prevent all fires from happening. So we still need to take these important steps. The annual wildfire losses range from 394 billion to 893 billion. A big chunk of that is the LA fires. And the wildfire risk to homes. 1 in 20 homes in the US faces higher extreme wildfire risk. And as I've been using these terms, I just wanted to clarify, hazard is something that can cause harm or injury. Risk is the probability or likelihood of a hazard causing harm combined with the severity of that potential harm. And so this will come in handy as we talk about our next slide. This is the FEMA wildfire risk map, and there is no one golden standard on wildfire risk mapping. There's several iterations of these maps available to you as and for your planning purposes or your awareness purposes. This particular map highlights that 1 in 20 homes in the US is at higher extreme risk from wildfire. It makes it seem as if the majority of the wildfire problem is a Western issue, but the reality is wildfire can occur anywhere that wildland-urban interface exists. And we talked about that being anywhere you have vegetation adjacent to structures. And so with the Marshall Fire in Colorado, that was a fast-moving grass fire. It wasn't what people traditionally think of as a wildfire, which typically involves forests. So the reality is the eastern crescent of the U.S. has more potential for wildfire losses than the west, but those haven't manifest with the exception of a few areas like Florida, New Jersey, Tennessee and some other areas. But that potential is there, and it's going to continue to grow as our weather patterns change. Let's just talk briefly about the phases of wildfire and where we can really have an impact. The proactive pre-fire phase is where prevention, like I mentioned, can be effective, where we can enact preparedness measures to help our communities understand wildfire risk and take life safety preparedness measures, like understanding their evacuation plan and how they're going to safely leave an area. And most importantly, the mitigation strategies, the things that we can do in advance of that wildfire to lower the potential impacts. Once the response phase is initiated, it's predominantly suppression and evacuation. This is where we see the majority of our fatalities. And it might be surprising, but many of those fatalities are actually happening in homes, not just on evacuation routes. So this is the phase where they have the opportunity to save the greatest numbers of lives. And in reality, if we can start to design communities and homes to not burn during a wildfire, we may be able to give first responders that extra opportunity to shelter folks in place, or if they have to take shelter in a structure, to have a safe place to go while that wildfire burns through a particular area. And then the most expensive phase of wildfire is the post-fire recovery and rebuilding. This is where you have secondary impacts like flooding, your economic losses. The cost of suppression is about 2% of the overall cost of a wildfire. 98% of that is inherited by the local community. And during that post-fire phase, majority of the federal and state resources, they go back home, they go to another fire, and communities are left to deal with those impacts. And it's creating a wildfire paradox. The wildfire risk increase across the board in frequency, intensity, and those impacts. It's the fastest growing hazard related damage in the US. There is no wildfire season anymore. This is a potential year-round event. The LA fires, for example, were in January. The Smokehouse Creek fire in Texas, where I'm based out of, was over 1 million acres in about 12 hours. And that was in February. And so we could have potential catastrophic fires year-round. So the idea of a fire season has slipped away. Suppression-only strategies backfired. Part of our challenge in the wildland fire community is that we've gotten so good at putting out the majority of wildfires. About 98% of those are suppressed with our initial attack. We're accumulating vegetation and fuels that would have historically been consumed by these naturally occurring wildfires. And this has led to an increase in urban conflagrations. So urban conflagration, if you didn't know, is that intersection when a wildland fire or a vegetative fire transitions from being vegetation driven to structure driven. And so historically conflagrations have been things like the Great Chicago Fire, which burned building to building. We're now seeing that in our wildland urban interface areas, and it's encroaching into urban areas. So it's a really important term to understand because that's what's causing majority of our losses. Start to think about a wildfire more like a fuse than the actual problem. It's what it burns into that's causing us issues. 98, as I mentioned, 98% of wildfires are effectively suppressed within the first 24 hours. So that's a good thing, except for it leads to that accumulation of fuels. There's no parallel with other natural disasters. So, for example, nobody's expecting firefighters to go down to the coast and lock arms and prevent a hurricane from reaching landfall. But there's that expectation because there's a scale of fire that firefighters should be able to handle anything. And that creates a false sense of security in the public and our leadership in other sectors. And the majority of those losses are happening on 2% of the wildfires. So just let that sink in. And what's driving that is they're mostly wind-driven fires. In California, we're all probably aware of the Santa Ana winds, which are a pretty regular occurrence. The fire in Hawaii was the dry side of a tropical storm. And so hurricanes are starting to drive these wildfires. The Bastrop fire, which resulted in the largest losses in Texas history, was the dry side of a tropical storm. So these weather events are becoming more and more interrelated. Fires lead to floods, storms lead to fires, and it's all interconnected. And it continues to cause destabilization in our insurance markets. I'm not sure what you're experiencing where you're at, but here in Texas, homeowners are getting letters from their insurance companies left and right, either dramatically increasing rates, canceling policies altogether, or requiring drastic measures that may exceed what's allowable in that jurisdiction, like clearing all the trees out of your yard when there's an ordinance that says you can't do that. So it's creating conflicts at that local level as well. And it's reached an unsustainable level where insurance companies are moving out of areas or just not writing policies and determining broad exclusion areas where they're just not going to write policies because of the underlying risk, and those factors being fuels, topography, weather, not necessarily the structures themselves. So we hope to, and what we're seeing is a more nuanced look at how insurance companies are evaluating coverage. We also are seeing delays in real estate transactions. If you can't have a mortgage, you can't have insurance, you can't have a mortgage. So it's making it difficult for folks to even sell their homes if they're in wildfire prone areas or maintain that coverage. I've heard direct reports from folks out of California that their insurance is now more than their mortgage. And so some real challenges for the public. We absolutely don't want people to lose their home from wildfire, whether it be from a social cause like insurance or a physical cause like the actual wildfire. So what are the insurance sectors looking for us to do as communities to align with this wildfire risk so they can continue that coverage? Is they want to see homeowner parcel level participation and mitigation. It means structure hardening and creating vegetative management areas around the structures. But that's not enough. They know that our homes built close together are interrelated. And so they're looking to see neighborhood level programs like Firewise Communities USA or other initiatives like Fire Safe, where people are working together as a community, understanding that shared risk. And the community scale through regulatory measures, building codes, vegetation management ordinance, and subdivision standards that lend themselves to align with our fire environments. So what does the science tell us? For sure, embers are the number one source of majority of home losses, about 90% of the home losses, and that's been verified through case studies over the last 20 years or so. I documented the first ember loss home in Texas, and it really started to change the way that we look at things, not just from a prevention standpoint, but from an operation standpoint. When homes are burning days after the wildfire has passed, it's not a wildfire issue, it's a home ignition issue. And the reality is, majority of homeowners and others aren't aware that there's steps that you can take to easily mitigate wildfire risk that are cost effective and make a big difference. We know that embers can travel large distance. The picture you're seeing here on the left is an ember storm. It's like a blizzard of embers, and they can travel far ahead of the fire and still be active. And so I'd like to say just because you're not in the woods doesn't mean you're out of them. What's really critical is a 0 to 5 non-combustible zone or as much spacing as you can give yourself between your home and where combustible vegetation or other materials start. And even a small break like this can help because embers are going to land and hit the side of the home and drop down into the vegetation where they can go unnoticed for a while as they ignite. We know that ignition resistant construction reduces risk. And the science has shown that to be effective, and structure separation distances matter. So how close we build our homes and how ignition resistant they are huge factors that we experienced in fires like the LA fire, which leads to the previous comment about the urban conflagrations being our new challenge in wildfire. And we know through these case studies, through research, how homes burn in wildfires. It's through predominantly these major points of vulnerability. Roofs that aren't constructed out of ignition resistant material are probably the most vulnerable aspect because those embers are raining down. But remember, these are wind events, and so the wind is also funneling these embers into vents and attic space, into crawl spaces, if you have pier and beam. And so they can intrude into the home and ignite the home from the inside. Decks can become fuses if they're not appropriately designed and attached to the structure itself. Everybody's intuition tells us that vegetation is the main problem, and it is a factor, but the reality is the embers are what are driving a lot of the vegetation ignition. In this picture on your left, what you're seeing is embers slamming into the side of the house and then dropping down into the vegetation and igniting it. Any combustible attachment can be a weak link, walkways, pergolas, wooden fences, other materials that are not ignition resistant, and then other adjacent structures, as I mentioned, causing structure to structure ignition. So some of the key takeaways in the research is we know that ember exposures are uncontrollable and unpredictable, and so we won't be able to stop these embers from raining down over our communities, but we can begin to design homes and build them not to burn. This is just a real quick video of a fire that we experienced here in Texas.
A grass fire raced through this Balch Springs neighborhood just southeast of Dallas. More than 24 homes damaged, many destroyed. The video on the right of your screen shows you what it looks like now. Some homes gone, others being rebuilt. Meteorologist Mario Ruiz here with more on the conditions that led to the. A year ago today,
And we'll skip the conditions because we've talked about it. Dry, windy weather, typically driven by storm fronts or other wind events. Then it speaks to the fact that that was residential grass burning those homes, hitting wooden attachments like fences, and quickly burning like fuses to the structures themselves. Think 2-inch residential grass, not your traditional wall of wildfire that our mind tells us logically that would cause homes to burn. Any fire that can reach your home and is unsuppressed has the potential to burn that home. And once any component of the structure ignites, because the resource shortages on these wildfire, it's likely that that structure will burn. This is a video from another fire in Central Texas, and it speaks to the threat to multifamily residential and other structures. And I show this to illustrate the barrage of embers the community is going to receive during one of these events. So right now you're looking at regular daytime camera view, and you can see a couple of areas where the fire is burning or has burned, mostly in the grassland. And so a lot of the trees have been left unburned. But as we start to switch to infrared, hopefully you can see clearly the profusion of embers coming off a couple of trees that are burning. Each one of those sparks has the potential of igniting downwind exposures. One last video from this series. This is from the Institute of Business Home Safety's research lab in South Carolina. And what they're able to do is demonstrate heat being funneled through a juniper tree and channeled towards a home that was built either out of ignition resistant material or non-ignition resistant material and landscaping. And if you notice, within less than 10 seconds, the mulch and landscaping on the corner of that building have ignited. The building on the right that's built out of ignition resistant material and surrounded by non-combustible river rock still hasn't ignited at 25 seconds and won't throughout the duration of the video. So this is just a quick demonstration of how embers affect a home and home ignition and how quickly that home can ignite under those conditions. But this isn't all fire and brimstone. There is a silver lining, and a lot of that comes from research from the fires that we're experiencing. These fires are catastrophic. What would be a tragedy is if we didn't learn anything from it and improve our overall safety. One of the things I really wanted to highlight from the NIST report from the Camp Fire is that there is a 51% of the single family homes built after 2008 in the path were undamaged. California had adopted Chapter 7, and now they've adopted the ICC 2024 code and rolled Chapter 7 into that code. But this just speaks to the value of structural hardening and that it does make a difference even during some of our country's most intense and catastrophic wildfires. So we'll move into that just real briefly. A case study, I mentioned the Marshall Fire, over 1,000 homes destroyed in a very short amount of time. It was driven by 100-mile-an-hour winds. 25% of the homes in the area were underinsured, and it's not traditionally considered an at-risk area. It took almost 3 years for them to break ground on the first rebuild. Homes that weren't lost during the wildfire were being condemned because of the toxic smoke that was entering into the structures and causing them to be uninhabitable. So the reality is it's not just a wildfire in the traditional sense. Grass fires and communities that were adjacent to agriculture and grasslands are very vulnerable. We're short on time, so I'm going to skip the Marshall Fire video real quickly, but it just highlights some things that we've talked about. Moving on to the Lahaina fire in Hawaii in 2023. This was our greatest loss of lives from a wildfire in U.S. history since the 1800s, excuse me. 102 lives lost, and 33 structures damaged. Historically, Hawaii isn't a fire-adapted ecosystem, meaning fire wasn't a natural part of the island's roles in many cases, but through the introduction of non-native species and grasses and other plants, it shifted the fire environment to being more fire-prone. Again, this was driven by a dry side of a tropical storm, and there was no codes in place on the islands that could have mitigated that. They're working really hard, and I'm excited to say Hawaii is making big progress in this area. They've hired a state fire marshal, and communities are starting to explore what code would work best for their local environment.
Hey, Justice,
Yes, please.
what does the dry side of a storm, what does that mean?
Yeah, so every tropical storm has a wet side and a dry side. And the wet side is where you get the rainfall. So when we think of hurricanes, we think of the rain. We don't talk about the dry wind so much. And so on the one side of the hurricane is the high winds and high distribution of rainfall and moisture. And on the back side of that is just a dry forced wind that is devoid of a lot of that same moisture, but just still has the winds.
Thank you.
Good question. And just for time, I'm going to skip that video, but it was just an overview of the Lahaina fire and the impacts that that community was feeling. So some considerations for fire officials, building officials, other practitioners working in the wildland-urban interface. The key to getting started is understanding that wildfire risk. And there's lots of great tools out there that can help us put our finger on the pulse of where wildfire risk exists. And then that can be refined at that local level. If you're wondering how to find out what the wildfire risk is in your part of the country, I'll give you some specific links and tools. The other thing that I wanted to drive home is that codes don't solve the wildfire problem. They're part of the solution, the suite of solutions that can help contribute to wildfire loss reduction. But the reality is it needs to be a comprehensive approach. And one of the best ways to participate in that process is to get involved in the development of your local community wildfire protection plan, or know what that plan recommends. In almost every case, there's a section that requires strategies for structure hardening. And so what that means is if your jurisdiction has adopted a community wildfire protection plan, they've already given leadership intent that structure hardening is a priority, and that strategies need to be explored for implementing that structure hardening as a priority. This is a screenshot of the wildfirerisk.org map, and it measures the relative consequence of wildfire to residential structures everywhere on the landscape, whether a home exists there or not. So this is one of the first nationwide efforts to look at relative wildfire risk across the country. And as you can see, a lot of that risk is in the Midwest and the Western states, but the South and the Northeast do have their share of wildfire risk. So this is really an everywhere issue now. I'll just pick on Arizona a little bit since Stacy's from there. This is the zoomed in risk to homes layer of the Arizona wildfire risk map. And as you can see, they've got significant wildfire risk. And to dial in a little bit further, I'll pick on, say, Flagstaff, Arizona. They have higher wildfire risk than about 98% of the communities in the country. And so Arizona is certainly wildfire prone and has that potential for continued significant losses like we've seen recently. If you happen to be in the fire service or part of the fire service, I'm on the International Association of Fire Chiefs Wildland Fire Policy Committee, and we've developed a really comprehensive guide that can be used by anybody, but also shared with local fire departments because they may not be aware of the resources that are available to them. And this can guide them through their role in participating in that process because fire officials are critical to code adoption, their credibility, and their knowledge, institutional knowledge is really important to be included in that process. So a little bit briefly while we kind of wrap up on ICC's mitigation strategy. We know that mitigation is the least understood of the 4 phases of emergency management. And what mitigation really means is any sustained action to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people or property from natural hazards and their effects. And so some examples of mitigation strategies in the wildland-urban interface. We can create defensible space, which means we look at the landscaping around our homes and our structures, and we make sure there's not a pathway for fire to travel from one area off of our property to the home itself. So think about it from the standpoint of, do you have vegetative grass that goes from the neighbor's woodlot directly to your wooden deck? How do we break those fuses in a way that's still aesthetically pleasing? Building materials are probably the most important aspect of wildfire risk mitigation. If a home's built not to burn, then we don't have a problem. Access and water supply are also critical for operational standpoint. And so any one of these areas from a wildfire standpoint, we can contribute to and make a big difference. But the reality is it takes all aspects of wildfire mitigation to really be effective. If you just create defensible space and your structure remains prone to ignition, then embers are going to hopscotch over your yard and land directly on this structure and ignite it. So it really takes a comprehensive approach. So ICC's wildfire mitigation strategy is three-tiered. We're advocating code adoption. Specifically, the current code cycle is the 2024 International Wildland-Urban Interface Code, which addresses the things that I mentioned: ignition-resistant construction and defensible space. But that's not enough. We also need sound land use planning. Subdivisions that are designed with multiple ingress, egress, wide enough roads and turnarounds, structure separation distances where appropriate, and setbacks off hillsides and other slopes where we know that overhanging structures, because fire travels uphill faster, are inherently more vulnerable than those set back. And that it's not just about buildings, it's about the people occupying these buildings and the communities that these buildings constitute. So community outreach and education and informed public and informed grassroots public is critical to the success of wildfire adaptation, especially when it comes to code adoption, because the reality is most codes aren't retroactive, like the Wildland-Urban Interface Code are typically adopted in that sense. And so this is a way to reduce the probability of things getting worse. We still have to solve the issue of existing structures, which is a challenge. But I will say one of the overarching challenges of code adoption is you're trying to adopt a code for buildings that are unoccupied. And so you don't have a voice saying this is something that we need to protect us, to protect our community. And that's why it's so important to have that community engagement, programs like NFPA, Firewise, Communities USA. If that program is in place in your jurisdiction, you're much more likely to be successful in code adoption because there's voices that can speak out for the need for this important safety measures. And one of my previous jobs, I was a contractor for NFPA teaching the home ignition zone training. And if you're not familiar with that training, it's a great class. And every time I taught that class, a homeowner would come up to me and say, I didn't know there was something I could do about wildfire. This changes everything. And so the reality is, by and large, the public doesn't understand their role in reducing this risk. The WUIC code, just to elaborate a little bit more, provides science-based methodology for construction and vegetation management. It reduces structure losses and improves firefighter safety, as we talked about. It supports the goals of Community Wildfire Protection Plan, of hazard mitigation plans, and other long-term resiliency strategy, climate resiliency plans. And just a few examples that I mentioned: California adopted the 2024 IWUIC. Colorado just adopted a statewide wildland-urban interface code. And if you're looking for an example at the municipal level, the city of Austin is the largest municipality outside of California to have adopted the WUIC code, including specific amendments for embers and the 0 to 5 non-combustible zone, which aren't currently in the WUIC code. So we talked about the elements of the WUIC code and the protection that it provides. There was a lot of questions around fire sprinklers and why we're asking folks to sprinkler the interior of structures when we're trying to protect them from an exterior fire. And the truth is, wildfires were started by homes burning and spreading to the wildland-urban interface, not just the other way around. And sprinklers can prevent structure-to-structure ignition once these urban fires initiate. There's almost never enough suppression resources to protect every home that's exposed. So in that context, the sprinklers become more and more important. Just to give you an idea of the footprint of where the WUIC code is currently adopted, and we're working to update this map as we speak. But there's 26 states and nearly 200 jurisdictions that have a code in place. In addition to California, Colorado, Montana, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Washington all have statewide adoption of the WUIC code or elements of the WUIC code. And federal buildings, including those that were burned in the fires in Arizona, the Lodge and others, are required to comply with IWUIC, which is a challenge for historical structures. So why adopt a wildland-urban interface code? We know that natural hazard mitigation saves property and saves lives. And there's real clear evidence, and this is just looking at all hazards. We'll dial into wildfire, that there's a 11-to-1 risk mitigation benefit. If you're applying for, say, and hopefully this will be something in the future, FEMA funding, their benefit analysis only requires a 1-to-1. And so this is an astronomical savings on the back end if we will mitigate these risks up front. And as it relates to wildfire, we're seeing on average about a 4-to-1 ratio of benefit to risk. And so it truly saves to invest the little bit of money that it takes to harden structures early on versus trying to retrofit those. And if you want some good research on the cost of wildfire ignition resistance, Headwaters Economics, which is a think tank out of Missoula, Montana, produced some just amazing work. And one of their most recent studies out of California indicated that new construction, you'll see anywhere from 0 to 2 to 6% increase in the cost of construction, whereas if you wait to retrofit an existing structure, it's upwards of $50,000 out of the gate. And so we can really make a big difference on the front end if we get ahead of this through code adoption versus trying to retrofit an existing problem. So just real briefly, some of the challenges to wildfire risk reduction. One of those is there's still a relatively poor understanding of the risk and mitigation strategies. Even the insurance companies who fund IBHS are trying to put their finger on what strategies we can all agree on that will result in effective mitigation. And I think that will be forthcoming soon. There's a lack of standardized wildfire data and modeling tools. And so how people are telling the story of wildfires, depending on what model they're using. And we all know models are as good as they can be, but aren't always 100% accurate and can create some confusion. For example, different layers of wildfire risk model different wildfire behaviors. So some might look at fire intensity, which will tell you what you're going to expect in a forest fire, whereas things like the fire's rate of spread will tell you how quickly it's going to move across the landscape. And there's certainly a better need for metrics to assess the price of wildfire risk reduction. I mentioned mapping is one of the major challenges of any jurisdiction. Every state that's adopted the Wildland Interface Code has come up against this challenge of reasonably identifying those areas at risk and then codifying that. And so there's some great tools. The U.S. Fire Administration has developed a WUI layer. This is the Austin version of that, which matches Austin's Wildland-Urban Interface map almost perfectly. So that adds credibility to the local efforts. It enables targeted mitigation and code enforcement. So we have credibility where we're adopting the code. Wildfire risk doesn't exist everywhere. And if we institute codes in places that the wildfire risk is incredible, then we're impacting overall effectiveness. And it can support grants and applications for community risk reduction. So mapping is really key. The good news is there's some tools out there that can help us dial that mapping in. So some real quickly, just to recap some of the best practices of community wildfire mitigation is participating in that community wildfire protection planning process and Your state forestry agency would be the best resource for telling you where those plans exist and do not exist. Adopting wildfire resistant codes and promoting the adoption of those wildfire resistant codes. Using science-based risk mapping and investment in data and infrastructure and risk modeling. So for example, one of the last things we did in the city of Austin was purchase camera detection system and are now aligning that with wildfire behavior mapping so we can get surgical there when we're going to do, for example, strategic shutoffs or other events that are going to affect that critical infrastructure, including mitigating wildfire risk around those critical infrastructure areas. And then most importantly, because we're not really talking about buildings here, we're talking about protecting the people that occupy those buildings, is that community and stakeholder engagement, including the whole spectrum from grassroots up to leadership levels to provide that leadership intent. So through that adoption, it enables us to have defensible space, which creates a separation between surface fires reaching our homes, fuels treatments, which protect our forest and wildland areas. Those are going to be much more easily to implement. If you're a prescribed fire practitioner, like I have been in the past, being able to burn adjacent to communities that are designed not to burn is a big relief, and we need more prescribed fire if we're going to solve this issue. It's part of our solution. It gives us the potential to shelter in place because many of the evacuation fatalities are related to evacuation, and so being able to hunker down when your community is designed appropriately could be a major life safety strategy. Providing emergency vehicle access and then firefighting water for the water supply. And just a few closing thoughts. The wildland-urban interface risk is growing, so must our preparedness to match that challenge. And I think you may have seen it, I mentioned previously, we've seen a 700% increase in fire intensity. So fires are absolutely getting worse. They're occurring year-round, and they're burning in areas where traditionally we haven't considered to be at high risk. Collaboration is the key to community resilience. This isn't an issue that one organization or entity can solve. I certainly learned that being in the fire service that there's limitations on what we can do, and that necessitates collaboration with other key stakeholders, forest and land managers, city planners, emergency management coordinators, and representatives from the community are all critical for the success of wildfire resiliency. We know that the ICC codes offer scalable science-based solutions, that it's critical that you get engaged in local wildfire planning processes because somebody's determining the potential outcome of our homes and our communities, that we advocate for WUI adoption at that state and local level, and that you leverage your expertise to shape safer, more resilient communities, because if you don't, who will? And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that I can field.
Thank you, Justice. What questions do you have out there? While someone else may be preparing, I will ask you a question. What have you seen to be the biggest help so far of your career? What have you seen have been the biggest changes taken to have a better mitigation plan?
Yeah, I think part of that answer is vulnerability on the fire service to acknowledge that this isn't something that we can solve on our own. And we're paid to solve problems, right? And so that's what your tax money goes to. But honesty is a part of that solution of asking for help from building officials, from planners, from developers, from our natural resource managers. So it really comes down to wildfire requires collaboration to solve.
How have the interactions with the federal government been? I mean, are you dealing with EPA, BIA, any of those other entities? Have they been responsive and helpful at the same time?
Yeah, they're experiencing some real challenges with the reorganization of the fire service. If you weren't aware, the U.S. is reorganizing the federal agencies under one cooperative entity. And so for the first time in U.S. history, we'll have a single federal wildfire fighting force. because the answer to your question is it depends on each agency and each manager at that local forest and what their budget and capacities are. So this, I think, will create much more uniformity in the way that our federal agencies are approaching wildfire response and mitigation. It certainly can be a challenge. Texas is unique in that we're 93% private land. And so, and the downside of that is if you have a community wildfire protection plan in your neighborhood and you're adjacent to federal land, they have to spend no less than 50% of their fuels budget in the WUI. So that's an easy fix. You just go to the Forest Service guys and you say, hey, this is on your side of the fence, fix it. We'll work on our side of the fence. Well, when you're dealing with private landowners, ranchers and others, it's not as always a smooth conversation. So that environment varies depending on where you're at.
Thank you. There is a question posted. Can you speak to ways a homeowner can guard against smoke inside the home if they have a fire retardant protected home?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that I saw in Flagstaff that I really liked, I was there for a recent training exchange, is when they do prescribed burns, which are a critical tool for fire safety, they distribute HEPA filters to any resident that's concerned or is a sensitive receptor. So that's one really strategic, tactical way that you can address that. But there's also filtration systems that you can add to your home. More stringent HEPA filters that can lower the amount of particulate matter that can enter the home itself. And what we're seeing with a lot of our homes being designed in the green building industry, where you have less airflow, they actually reduce the smoke intrusion through design of the structure themselves.
Thank you. And as usual, we're getting lots of questions about posting your contact information in the slide deck. And if you're willing, we can get it posted. Is that right, Daniel? We would post it? Or is it sent out individually?
No. If Justice is okay, we'll take the PDF and we'll kind of do a past webinar link, unless you want the contacts and prefer to send it out yourself. That's your call, Justice, but whatever preference you want. Or sometimes the answer is, unfortunately, there's so much copyright material that we can't post it.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely happy to share my contact information.
Thank you. And Daniel, it kind of looks like that your background might be one of the slides that Justice just presented.
I like the Van Gogh nightmare comment.
Yeah.
That's the way my life feels most of the time as of late.
That's fantastic. Oh my goodness. Well, any other questions for Justice while he is here with us? I don't see any. So I think we can go ahead and conclude this workshop. And Justice, we cannot thank you enough for everything that you're doing. I honestly hear of these efforts being done in the outcropping of what's going on in your daily life. So really to see what you're doing and on the front lines literally is inspiring, number one, super helpful, number two, and really eye-opening. But we can do in our everyday lives, in our industry, to be able to help support your efforts. So thank you very much. Lots of good feedback coming through the webinar chat, which I'm sure you can see.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate everybody's time and attention. I know that's precious. So thanks for sharing some of it with me.
Thank you so much. Okay. Everybody, if you are going to be joining session 3, then we will be starting that at half past the hour. So in about 20 minutes. And we'll be preparing the next speaker and getting ready. And we're doing a board meeting at the beginning of that one, a short board meeting, because we have one vote that we need to take formally as a group on our bylaws adoption. So thank you so much, Justice. Have a great day. And for those of you that will be joining us, we'll see you in about 20. For those of you that can't join us, thanks for being here.
Quick reminder.
Yes.
When we exit out this webinar, leave it up, everyone. You'll see a link for registering your CEUs. So go ahead and click that. It looks ominous sometimes, but it's perfectly safe and it should be for part 2. If you don't get the link, you can always go to CSINext.org and then under the About CSI, fill out the generic one.
Good.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Okay, bye everyone.